Hey everybody, just got finished talking with Scott Savage about William Stringfellow, the powers, principalities, rulers, and authorities of this present darkness, and what they are, what it means for our relationship with Jesus, what it means for our engagement with American politics and politics in general, what it means for our interaction with our company. It's just this wonderful conversation that I hope challenges and encourages you to ask more questions about where our devotions may be diverted from Christ. So Scott has been a pastor for a while now. He's ordained in 2006. He's been lead pastor of Santa Monica Church of the Nazarene since April of 2014, and wrote his dissertation, A Reflexive Approach to Christian Witness, a Theology of Social Involvement through the Life and Writings of William Stringfellow, in 2023. This idea, the powers of principalities, I was first introduced to it in my seminary studies, probably 2010, 2011-ish, through Marshall Johnston, and it is one of the, like I talk about in our discussion, it's one of the pillars of my understanding of who Jesus is, who I am, and how I need to relate to Jesus in this world. So I hope that this benefits you. So yeah, welcome Dr. Scott Savage to the podcast. All right, so Scott, welcome to the podcast. And I've been planning on the very first thing that I say to you for a while is I've been talking with my son about this project of mine to try to do a podcast, and he's an aspiring YouTuber. He's got his own YouTube channel. He does videos with his VR headset, and then he asked who I was going to interview next, and I said it was this guy named Scott Savage, and he looked at me. He goes, "Dad, that is an awesome name. Why didn't you name me Scott Savage?" I said, I don't know, man. I don't know. It is an awesome name. I mean, do you feel that you carry a lot of responsibility in life having a name like Scott Savage?
No responsibility. I do find it funny that, like, growing up, I was always aware that, like, I never had a nickname. Like in sports, people call me Savage, but it was a non-issue. And then, like 10 years ago, the word savage started to be used in culture. Like, that was so savage or something like that. And that's when it shifted. And people, like, I'll call, like, customer service on something, and, like, more than once people have been like, "That's a cool last name." Like, well, okay. I got to give my dad credit and his ancestors.
Well, and going together, Scott Savage. I mean, it sounds like a professional wrestler now. I guess it wasn't Randy Savage? Wasn't he a professional?
Randy the Macho Man Savage.
Yeah, Scott Savage, man. You could have been his predecessor, not predecessor, his successor.
I can't wrestle. I tried once in middle school and I died. So
I gotta say.
I will say this though. There's a story. When I was a kid, my dad's name is Rick, and I didn't know this. Somebody calls the house and they go, "Are you Rick Savage?" And he's like,
"Yes, I am."
Yeah. And they're like, "The Rick Savage?" And I'm gonna butcher their role. I think the drummer or the bassist, one of those guys of I think it was Led Zeppelin, is named Rick Savage. So he got somebody looked up for Rick Savage and, like, called our house back when you had the book, the white pages, when you could just look people up.
Well, and what a horrible question too. Like, are you the Rick Savage? Like, because then your dad's faced with the option to say, "No, I'm not the Rick Savage. I'm just a Rick Savage." Yeah,
just one of them.
So I did some research on you, and I found a great website of little slick, clean-shaven Scott Savage on the Manchester Wesley Research Center, and
there was a time.
I think you could wrestle that Scott Savage right now and win. And,
Maybe, I
yeah,
don't know. He was younger.
that's
He was
true.
younger.
That's real. That's real. He can take out that shoulder or that knee. Yeah.
Oh,
So you've been pastoring for a while now. You've been, I mean, just at um, Santa Monica Church of the Nazarene, right? Since April of
mhm.
2014, and through that process, at some point you said, I need to go and get a PhD and write a dissertation on the reflexive societal realities and William Stringfellow. What made you want to go and do doctoral studies?
Yeah. Strangely enough, the that desire started slightly before the move. Two things converged in my life. We were living in Kansas City at the time. I was working as an associate pastor at
Mm,
a church, and started to just feel two urges. One was continuing my education in some way, and two was moving on to what my calling was, which was to pastor a church.
mm,
Um, and so when we moved in April of 2014, I had been working on it like at the very beginning. In fact, it was 2014 that I was in the process of submitting
mm-hmm.
like my proposal. So technically, the clock didn't start till January of 2015. But in 2013, I was already beginning to work on it with
Your
somebody I was
proposal,
going to
that was
work
like
with,
your like
and
to like your entry, like the like your paper to be accepted. Is that
yeah. So the way the British system works is you write a proposal before you start research about what you want to
mm,
research on, basically. So it's a
yeah, yeah.
terrifying process of trying to say something about what you think you want to say before you've actually done
Right,
any work.
right, yeah,
Like,
yeah.
it's
That's
yeah.
intimidating.
So that was a little bit of a process. It was really intimidating. It was the first time I had entered into anything of that sort of depth and um, um, thoughtfulness. You had to sort of make sure you could present like, I think if I do this, this is where my questions are
Right, right.
leading me. I think if I bring these things together, I can get there. Um, and so yeah, but the, you asked
Yeah,
what
yeah,
made me
yeah,
want to go do
yeah.
that. um, I so two things. I felt after seminary that I wasn't done with formal
Mm-hmm.
education, um, and but I wasn't ready to jump into it. So it was 3 years before I decided to start pursuing the PhD. I had a 3 year window where I was sort of like, I'm gonna take a break. I'm being out of school. I'm gonna work in this church. Um, but it was rumbling. Honestly, when it comes down to it, and we could do a whole
Mm-hmm.
podcast on this. Needed to do it to prove to
Yeah,
myself that I
yeah.
could. I don't know if I'll use it or transition or not transition. I'm a pastor for life, but if teaching becomes part
Mm-hmm.
of that calling, um, I don't know what that looks like for me in the future. But I wanted for myself to know that I could write and think
Yeah.
at that level of depth. And I liken it to I don't know if you're familiar with Richard Rohr's first and second
Mm-mm.
halves of
No,
life
no.
concept. He says the first half of life is sort of all
Mm.
about you, and you do this with children, right? You affirm them, you tell them they're loved, like everything is directed towards them, so that they kind of grow up with this established sort of concept that they are loved by the people around them and by their heavenly Father. Uh, but the second half of life is the maturing process. I shorthand it by saying in the first half of life you need to know that you're loved, in the second half you need to
Mm.
become love. So there's a pouring in and then there's a pouring out. And Roar like elaborates on that concept. That's kind of my
Mm.
summary take on him. And for me, the PhD, and this is not a comparison because there are people for whom scholarly level work is second half of life
Mm-hmm.
maturing and they're
Yeah,
gifts
yeah,
to the church. For me, it belonged in the first half of life because if I didn't do it, I would have
yeah.
felt stunted. I didn't have that language when I started. That this is part of my processing of
Mm-hmm.
what's happened. Um, and so for me, I was like, I need to get past this for my own like continual spiritual maturity. And if I don't, I'll always have this hanging over my head about whether or not I could have done this kind of
Yeah.
work. And so that's
Well,
what it was for me.
I resonate with that. I don't. I didn't have any of that context of Roar's perspective, but I always knew that I didn't feel like I was going to be true to myself if I didn't pursue PhD work. I don't know why. I just always knew that. And maybe, I don't know, maybe there's some carnal pride in that. Maybe there's something in me that feels like it needs to be at the top level, and that's something I need to grow out of, But I always knew that I would want to do that. I would want to pursue a PhD of some kind. Yeah.
There are things to know about the Christian tradition, history, the oral, the biblical, like all those aspects of it. But it's like, at the end of the day, this is one of the reasons why I love the Orthodox tradition. Not an expert in it, just I read it as much as I can, and just have sort of stayed next to it over the years. It's all wrapped up in the life of prayer. Prayer and worship, the Catholic, like they would call it the beatific vision or something like that. Like it's the attention of your heart to the divine reality around us.
Right.
But it matters what we say about God.
Yeah. Right.
It matters how we talk about this God that we are communing with, and how we understand what atonement means, and the history that goes with that, in relationship to the creation of all things and the redemption of all things, like where it's going. All those things matter, but they matter so that we can pray. They matter so that we can be present to the world around us and ourselves in the way that we were called to in Genesis. The image there, keep until the earth. I think that's the right image. I say to my church, if that doesn't make sense to you, it means make things live.
Yes.
Like, whatever that means, go make things live.
Yeah.
Don't be about death. And this is a nice transition into Stringfellow.
Yes, it is.
Don't be about death.
Yeah.
Be about life.
Yeah.
In the broadest, most flourishing sense of the word. And of course, the next thing I say is, if you don't know what that means, go learn to care about the things that Jesus cared about. That'd be a good start.
Yeah. Yeah. It all goes together. The one body, many members. And we need those people who remind us to not focus everything on the letter of the law and linear logical explanations of everything. They say no, dive down into the spiritual depths with the Spirit, right? And then I think there's a place for people like us to say, hey, you can't read the Bible in a way that validates slavery. Like, I know it's been done before, but that's just wrong, and bad theology can really hurt people. Like, I'm sorry, God will allow things you can't handle to come into your life. That's kind of his MO. He lets that happen so that you call on his name and you trust him and not in yourself. Like, that's just kind of how it works. So, like, no, when you were discouraged at the cancer prognosis, that wasn't you failing to have the strength that God told you could have by letting you have that prognosis. No, falling in his arms, helpless, is exactly what you are called to do and can do. So I think it's both. Yeah. It takes both. The teacher and prophet is, in Acts 13 has always been special to me, that there were prophets and teachers there that fasted and prayed and launched the great missionary movement with Paul and Barnabas. Yeah. So your dissertation, the way that I understand your dissertation is basically society shifts because people are always capable of reflecting on their circumstances and making choices to change their life circumstances. And so therefore society is always changing. And so whatever whatever Christians are going to do to bear witness to Jesus, it can't just be like one kind of systematic methodological program, but it has to be a evolving process of us reflecting on society as it fluxes, and to bear witness specifically along the lines that Stringfellow called us to, which was through, here I wrote this down, a process of witness that is just as reflexive as society itself. One, acknowledging the raw reality of the fallen world, not sugarcoating it at all. Second, standing against injustice of wrongs, specifically against the powers and principalities of this present darkness. And third, advocating on behalf of others through prayer and through practical earthly action. Is that a fair abstract of what you undertook to do with your dissertation?
Yeah. The hinge move is what you said in the first part of what you said was trying to think about Christian witness in terms of reflexivity, which we can define in a minute, but how we engage with the world around us, and it acts on us. We act back. Mm-hmm. That's the process of social transformation or stability, because you might not act to change society. Mm-hmm. But it happens in and through human reflexivity, the internal conversation that we have with ourselves about what's happening to us and what we want to do back. That's not mine. That's the base level work of a social theorist named Margaret Archer.
Right.
So I kind of took her work and tried to pair it with the concept of Christian witness. My broader question that situated that had to do with how we understand what it means to engage socially and why we would do that. Because I was really I've always wrestled with the idea of progress, that Christian witness can move in the world in such a way that we would ultimately and finally bring about a perfect, what I said in the thesis, a perfect political expression of the kingdom of God, as if that was the task.
Right.
And I don't think it is. But there's injustice, there's problems in the world that we are called to act on and to change. Mm-hmm. So how do we reconcile the call to, like in the thesis I used the American history of slavery and oppression against black people in particular. There's lots of ways I could have taken injustice in America, but I singled in on that.
Sure, yeah.
And I said, nobody would have looked at black people in the 1700s, or the 1800s, I should say, and say, you don't need to worry about what Abraham Lincoln's trying to do. Like, it doesn't matter. Just believe. Like, of course, like, we wanted to end slavery. We want that to stop. In 100 years later with the Civil Rights Movement, like, we want these social changes. These are good. These are necessary. These are important. So nobody looks at that and it says that doesn't matter. And the tricky part is that it looks like progress. Mm-hmm. Right. Like, it looks like things are changing towards the better, and that's the end of it. That's the goal. Right. And I want to say we shouldn't conceive of that as terms of progress, because what kind of two staple things I put in the thesis is that if we believe that God is sovereign over the outcome of history, that this is not an end that we are making happen for ourselves, but something God is bringing about, given that, and then two, given, and I connected this to a theological concept, but given that God is responsible for our salvation, not us, so that's your grace thing, like this is solely on the divine initiative to redeem us, right. And to bring us to our good end. Right. What is this call to go and bear witness? Yeah. Right. And these acts that we are called to do that, the saints throughout the ages have changed the world. Right. So what does that mean? And I eventually concluded that these are not part of like a chain of events that lead to an end. They are penultimate expressions. They just simply stand alone as witnesses of what God has done in Jesus. Mm-hmm. So we go and we try to end slavery because it's good to do that. Right. Because that's what God is like. Right. And whether or not, like, I think I said in the thesis, let's say we eradicate all forms of slavery in the world. We finally get to a point where it's perfect. that doesn't mean that 1,000 years from now it might not rear its ugly head again,
Right.
because the possibility of slavery still exists. And that would then be a way of talking about principalities and powers, this idea that humans might dominate or control other people. And so, but what we've done in that moment, let's say we end slavery and oppression of people, we can say, this is what the kingdom of heaven is like.
Right, right.
And we do our best, but we don't think that we've achieved the kingdom. And that's a tricky dynamic. It's not like we are bringing about the kingdom. It's the way of just saying this is what God is like, and in the end, what God brings about is something like this.
That's interesting.
I don't know if that's very clear. You can push back with some questions.
No, it's totally. It's what you said is totally clear, and it is interesting because I'm not Reformed. My friend that I talked with about presuppositional epistemology in the first episode I did, he is Reformed. I mean, that's a very Reformed approach, presuppositional apologetics, and what I wanted to do in my conversation with him is to make space where this epistemology is true, and I don't think he would argue with me in a loving way. I don't think you have to be Reformed to hold to a presuppositional epistemology. I don't think there is another consistent epistemology, right? And so I wanted to create space for people to process through the concepts of that way of looking at life. Sometimes our theology, our theological baggage, can get in the way of us receiving or processing through different concepts. And so what I want to do right now is I want to pave the way to say, what we're going to be discussing as we discuss the powers, principalities, rulers, and authorities, a theology of the powers that, because you can engage these concepts regardless of the theological baggage you bring to this conversation, because some people think that there's not going to be progress, right? They think things are going to get worse and worse and worse and worse and worse until the rapture, and then there's the tribulation, and depending on pre-trib, post-trib, whatever you are, they have this idea that things are going to get worse and worse and worse, and then there's the usually more Reformed perspective that things are going to get better and better and better, and we should have a theonomy, the post-millennial view, which is we are going to get good enough to where we are going to have an earthly kingdom that is the reign of Christ. And so what I hear you saying is probably more of how I see things, is that humanity is progressing. We're moving forward through time, and you and I are talking just across the state of California, actually just across Southern California, but we're able to have this interview, with it's going to be live. Anyway, all the technology we have is phenomenal, and then people use the same technology, to spread the porn industry with all of the, rape culture and drug culture that goes along with that. Right, human trafficking, which is a form of slavery, and we have nuclear power plants and nuclear bombs. So my view is humanity is progressing, but humanity is the same, and the Christian's calling is to stand in the midst of the whirlwind of history that is at its end cyclical, and to call people to the center where Christ is, and so I resonate with what you're saying, but whether you're post-millennial, premillennial, amillennial, whatever you are, the Bible talks about these powers and principalities, rulers and authorities, and we've got to process through the fact that there's the kingdom of God, in which God is king, Jesus is king, right? He created everything, and he ruled over it all. Then he created humanity in his image to take dominion, to represent the kingdom of God on earth. And the whole story that we're living out is, are we submitted to the authority, or are we living the lie that we can split our authorities, serve both God and money, or serve both God and country, or both God and whatever? Or are we just giving our devotions to these other rulers and authorities in this present darkness? That was not a question, but a statement. But I think it's important for us to have this theological neutrality, if you will, so that we can allow ourselves to process these concepts. I think it's important for a postmillennial person to really do a lot of processing that no earthly kingdom has ever and may never fully represent the kingdom of God. I mean, post Genesis 3.
Yeah. I mean, I think, to go back to your statement.
Yeah.
I think it's important maybe to like give a little groundwork for what the principalities and powers are.
Okay.
And there's not a one. The hard part is there's not one way of thinking about this sort of across the church. So this is still being debated. In fact, even as I was preparing for this, I wrote about the principalities and powers in a particular way through the lens of William Stringfellow, and just was realizing how much I didn't engage with for my thesis, because there's just a broad way of thinking about these things. This language, if for those listening who don't know, comes from Paul's letters, right? In several places he refers to the principalities and powers. It's this language. I'm not going to get into the Greek. I don't think I would do it justice here right now. But it's this language of that there is something present other than God and humans, and that's the question: is sort of what is that? And it gets spoken of, and this is the tough part. I think we historically have tried to say more about what they are than we probably have warrant to. And so the kind of common way of thinking about it is the principalities and powers are the angels and the demons and the devil.
Right.
Everything that's not God, that lies beyond the visible sort of physical world around us. It's when Paul refers to those things, visible and invisible, it would be on the invisible side of things, the spiritual realm. But I think we have to be careful, because what people hear in the modern world is devil with a pitchfork,
Right.
Demons that are possessing people, or demons are on every corner that are like behind you, trying to like marionette you into doing like things that you
screwing up your sound system on a Sunday morning. Like that's definitely a demon, and not just a bad amplifier. Yeah.
Now I do refer to them as ghosts in the machine.
Yeah.
But I don't think they're demons.
Gremlins.
Yeah, gremlins. But I have to be really cautious, because I don't think it's the way we sort of modernly conceive of them. I have a hard time imagining a being called like the devil that is sort of equally opposite powerful as God, that is sort of competing for the dominion over all things. I was just talking to somebody recently about this. I was like, the entire story of God and the salvation of the world is not really a war. It's over.
Right.
It's a proclamation of victory that really wasn't a battle to begin with.
Right.
And so we have to remember that, like, whatever it means to bring to reconciliation all things at the end of time and space, and whatever that means.
Well, Colossians 2, right? He's overcome the powers and principalities and put them to open shame. Like it's done. Yeah.
It's done.
Yeah.
Now, and so like that passage in particular is interesting too, because Paul alludes to the idea that they're the principalities and powers in the spiritual places, but also the principalities and powers that put Jesus on the cross, meaning like Pilate and Rome. And so there's not a clear demarcation between spiritual beings and maybe like the nation state, or
Jesus,
the seduction of capitalism and greed.
Yeah,
like,
a great place,
a
great place for the
really
rulers.
Closely together.
A great place for the rulers and the authorities outside of Paul is somewhere in Luke, right, where Jesus says, "When they bring you before the rulers and the authorities, And Paul uses these words, rulers and authorities, almost in parallel with powers or principalities, right? And Jesus says, when they carry you before the rulers and the authorities, don't worry about what you will say. The Holy Spirit will give you utterance in the moment, what you need to say, right? And like nobody thought Jesus was talking about them being drugged between like demons,
Right.
Like it's literal. The whatever organization, institution, or even like philosophical idea that can exert authority over somebody. And of course, in Luke, it was, rulers and authorities like governors and precepts and emperors.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Pharisees.
Right. Yeah. I mean, that's when I try when
Let's not forget the church itself
100%,
is a principality and power.
100%. The Santa Monica Church of the Nazarene Incorporated, Grace Church Incorporated, like we can, they can exert authority over us. And so if
well, and that's the strange thing. You just brought this up, and I think this is important, and this is why I tied it to Archer's work, is because it is not like they have there is this sense of a force, there is this sense of a presence and exertion that we feel against us.
Yes.
Like I often describe it as saying, like, when you go to the doctor's office, it's not just you and the doctor, it's the entire healthcare system.
Right.
And that healthcare system has an energy, a force that may or may not work for you.
Right.
100%. And so it's not just somebody's trying to say, hey, can you help me? There are all kinds. The law is the same way. Church politics are the same way. Like, when churches meetings happen, all of a sudden you might feel that there's this force working against you, against what you feel is good. Stringfellow is, I said in my thesis, he's notorious for naming the powers. Like he says everything's a power, and here's some examples. And he just like everything you can think of that might be in existence in the world is a principality and power because it exerts a force of some kind.
What do you think about that?
And I think that's what's interesting.
Do you agree with it?
I agree with him that I feel my experience of these things are not like demonic possession or like sightings of the devil or anything like that. I can't speak to those things because I've never experienced anything like that. But I do feel like as a pastor, I pastor a small church that would, for all intents and practical purposes, if you compared the people who get to speak at conferences about churches, like we would not be a very significant church.
Right.
And so I feel that pressure, that the power, the principality and power of what a successful church is.
Sure. Yeah.
What a faithful church is.
Right.
So I would say like that, I feel it in those realms, and that compounds with like, my calling as a pastor. Like, am I doing this right? Do I feel this pressure to be a certain kind of pastor, or am I living into the calling that I feel like I've been given to be a certain person in the world with this, like that would be an example from my life. I've heard N.T. Wright though give an example, and he uses psychologist, but M. Scott Peck wrote the famous book, The Road Less Traveled. And he wrote another book after that. I'm relaying N.T. Wright's story here, but I think it's powerful. He says M. Scott Peck is not a Christian, not a believer, but he had come across people in his therapy times, his people he was working with, very small percentage for whom he could have no other explanation other than the sense that there's something else going on, something powerful beyond the sort of normal psychological explanations that would explain someone's behavior or what's going on in their life. Stories like that just give me pause to think. It's not just, when Jesus cast out the demons, it wasn't just a primitive way of understanding psychological distortions. But I'm saying I'm open to that possibility that there's more, because I think I have to be.
Right.
Even if I've not experienced myself things like that. And so but the powers, like broadly speaking, are forces that we feel act on us. And Archer's work is important because she comes at this from a social theorist perspective, not from a inherently religious perspective, although she is Catholic. She says when humans enter into this world, we're born into this world where there are social structures that act on us, social structures that have causal powers in and of themselves, sort of out beyond even outside the humans that are involved in them. So like the best example in modern time I can think of is the office of the presidency. You might go into that office with plans to do good, but the office itself is a power. And the information you get and the experiences you have and the questions you have to deal with exert influence, causal power on you. And I'm not saying one way or the other about what that means, other than to say that that's the dynamic. So you enter into this thing, and it's not just you deciding. There's this outside force that acts on you.
Right.
And then you have to, that's where the reflexivity comes in. You have to go through this, for Archer, it's discernment, deliberation, and decision. You have to discern what's going on. You have to deliberate about the course of action you want to take, and then you have to decide
So
how you're going to move in the
that
world.
word reflexive is basically the bounce back between how the world is, how you respond to that. So the world influences you. You reflect that influence back to the world with the choices you make, whether to change it or to uphold, whatever that influence is. And so there's this reflexivity of the world influencing you or society, group of people, whatever, and me or them shaping the world, and that's an ongoing process. Is that what you mean by reflexivity, or what the field means by that?
She calls it her fancy word is the morphogenetic cycle. And the cycle is important because it's the beginnings, the course of deliberation, the internal conversation we have, the decisions we make. There's a new social reality because every time humans act on the world, even if you don't see it, society has been reconfigured in some way or stabilized, but everyone's society's constantly having this reflexive engagement, and then it starts over.
Yeah.
So, you might discern a course of action in one moment, and then the fallout creates a new social dynamic that then leads you to act and discern in a different way
Sure.
the next time, because things have changed. And so it's that sort of ongoing process that she theorizes about, that I say, well, what if we talk about Christian witness this way?
Yeah. Well, that's
if we talk about Christian witness as reflexive.
yeah, and maybe like a down to earth example of that would be like parenting, right? Like your kid does a behavior, and you discipline a certain way, right? Maybe there's consequences of removing screen time or whatever, right? But then as the kid responds to that and grows, then a year later they might make the same mistake, but because they've shown they have changed due to how you responded, that in that point you may just see that as a slip up, and you may not have the same response to that. You may be like, oh buddy, like, man, that was weird. We haven't done that in forever. What's going on? So your whole response might be different because your initial response actually changed the way the world was working. Is that kind of how? So the reflexivity is always in flux. It's always changing because we change the world changes us, and we're always just processing, moving forward in that.
Yeah. And so Christian witness then becomes that constant engagement with what does it mean to offer back, what kinds of things are we offering back to the world that move to change it. And I can't deny that, because I think a lot of non-Christian folks would be like, I don't want Christian influences in this world. And I understand the hesitancy.
Sure.
But I want to hold that piece because of what I think Christian witness is, what I think the kingdom of God is, which is human flourishing and goodness in the broadest sense. And I think it's actually something that if you're human, you want, because it's what it means to be alive. Now, that then implies that there's a church capable of
Sure.
like demonstrating that sort of good life. I think there are. I think they're less around than we think they are.
Yeah.
And I think maybe this is the harder part too. I think it might only be a moment. Maybe a church goes years without demonstrating really like what the kingdom of heaven is like, and then all of a sudden like X, Y, and Z happens, and people find themselves laying down their lives the way Jesus did.
Yeah.
You know, and so it doesn't have to be like, it can be momentary. I guess that's what I'm trying to say, is it's not like this eternal, lasting, like through space and time, the Christian witness. I'm saying like it could be that. It could also just be like in a burst of a moment in time, the kingdom of heaven showed up, and then that demonstration went away. But for that moment in time, you know, it's a lot of things, is what I'm saying.
Yeah. Well, just the faithfulness of Christ, right? That, you know, we all know in part and prophesy in part. And I don't know if you listen to the what was it, the Rise and Fall of Mars Hill podcast that just talked about, you know, what I would call a super unhealthy organization, not representing, you know, Christ's humility and the way of the kingdom, which is not through the power of influence and domination. And God saved and touched and ministered to a lot of people through that broken system. You know, it's like, you know, what is it? This is a true and trustworthy statement that Christ came into the world to save sinners. Well, what was his other option? You know, and if God's going to move through any church or any person, he's going to move through churches and people who know in part and prophesy in part and have a lot of their perspectives and activities wrong. And it's just, but Jesus said, I'm going to build my church, and death itself, the gates of Hades can't stand against it. Like he's building it, and it's so grateful for his faithfulness in that. Scott, I think before we move on to start talking about Stringfellow's and the approach that you worked up in your dissertation of because it's very interesting, because there's different perspectives on how once we even wrap our mind around powers and principalities and rulers and authorities, like, so then what do? Like, there's the Anabaptist tradition that says, like, don't engage in politics, you know, at all, like be pulled away, be separate, influence as a prophetic witness from without. But it seems that Stringfellow has more of a, hey, no, we need to engage. Like, we need to be influence from the Christian perspective. And so it's I'm very interested to hear like how you process through all that as you process through Stringfellow's theology of the powers. But I think we need to just do just a little bit more time on like defining what a ruler and authority and power and principality is. Like, I think we're both in agreement that it can be demons. I think we can overdo the whole demon thing. I have had one experience that sure seemed like a demonic experience, a demonic possession, and it was wild. Sometimes I don't like to tell those stories because sometimes it feels like we're glorifying the demons, and those stories are just really sometimes we miss the point because we're focusing on the coolness of the story, and we miss out on Jesus in the midst of it all. But like this idea that there are innumerable things that can exert authority over us, and those things can show up as powers and principalities, rulers and authorities of this present darkness, like Paul talks about in Ephesians chapter 6, right? That pulls our devotion away from Jesus. And since they're not Jesus, they're not the author of life, they cannot offer us life. All they really offer us is death in exchange for our devotion, right? I know Stringfellow gives an example of like a law firm where a guy gets a job at a law firm that he really wanted to work with, and then he gets married, and he's called in by the partners, and they say, hey, why did you get married? We didn't give you permission to get married. That's kind of an extreme example of how, you know, this law firm, our careers, or the specific company we work with, can be this institution that tries to have authority over us and want us to be more devoted to it than even like our family. I mean, recreational sports can be a rule and authority that we spend all of our time taking our kids to games instead of attending to their faith or our activity with our community of faith. So, I mean, is there any other ways that you've found that are helpful in helping us understand this concept of what the powers and principalities can be besides just demons, like in the world that we like interact with on a daily basis?
Yeah, I mean, it's tricky, and I'll clarify just for the sake of the podcast. I'm hesitant to talk about demons because there's so much misunderstanding around that. So, like when Stringfellow talks, this is why Stringfellow was helpful for me, because like when he talks about the demonic, it is. He doesn't ever really talk about. I mean, he mentions angels and demons, but like what he talks about are the social implications. So he doesn't talk about beings in the spiritual realm with any sort of elaboration. And so I'm always careful. I'm not sure exactly what to do with all that because there's not a monolithic sort of take on it in the Christian faith.
Sure.
And so my
Gotcha.
language is, I think of the demonic, I think of it as an inversion of the angelic, the good, what they were supposed to be, and failed to be.
So what I hear you saying is that you don't buy into the theory that the sons of God, the sons of God, fallen angels, came down and mated with the daughters of men in Genesis chapter 6, creating the Nephilim. And then when the Nephilim died, that their souls, not being fully human or fully divine, that their souls were trapped on this earth, and they were the demons that Jesus was casting. That's not your thesis.
Yeah, I'm gonna skip that one.
Okay, fair enough. Okay.
And like even in the scriptures, that like the conception that there's a fallen angel named Lucifer who led this like massive rebellion against God is not in the Bible.
100%. 100%. Lucifer is not his name. Like the word Lucifer only shows up in in Isaiah 14, and only in the King James Version, because the Hebrew behind the word Lucifer is Hallel, the Greek is Heosphorus, the Latin is Lucifere, and so the translators of the King James Version capitalized the L in the Latin Lucifere, and now we all know that Satan's name is Lucifer, but it's just the shiny, the shiny star of the morning or whatever, and so it's crazy.
Which, as I recall, I was looking this one up recently. It's Isaiah 14, right? And it's referring to a Babylonian king.
100%. Yeah, and it's talking about the myth based on Venus, which is the morning star that rises and then falls, and there's a myth of a god that rises, but then it's like the whole what's the guy who flew too high and his wings touched the sun? And
Icarus.
It's just like an Icarus thing, the guy he exalted himself so much and then he fell. Yeah.
Now, and this is like all that is like I'm thumbs up on, like, let's not say too much.
Yeah.
But I also want to affirm that there is this antagonistic force in creation that is present, and it is tricky sometimes to discern blatant rebellion against God and whether or not there is built into the creative world a sort of antagonistic force.
Sure.
Like the guard, like in Genesis 3,
Well, in Daniel, he starts praying, and there's this angel is released to him, but he's delayed by the prince of Persia until Michael, the archangel, comes and fights for him. Now was that another form of apocalyptic language on Daniel's part, or is we're supposed to take that literally? Like to your point, there's just no way to hammer out an accurate systematic theology of angels and demons, and it may not even be that helpful at the end of the day.
I think it's helpful. Like you're getting my hesitancy here. Like this is sort of how I want to engage in the scriptures, right? Because I don't want to pretend like things aren't there that are there.
Right.
But I really am cautious about saying too much if there's no room to say more than what we should. And oftentimes, what I think is that what it means to be in creation is to live, and Stringfellow, I think, would affirm this, is to be alive in this creative world is to live in a world that is full of death. It's fallen. That's what he means by that. The fallen world is the world succumbed to the reality of death in all its forms, not just the cessation of life, but all the grotesque things that happen along the way, whether it's murder or the way you think in your mind about it, if you think little of yourself, like that's a reality of death that is infecting you. All of that stuff.
Right.
And I think that however you read Genesis 3 as a moment in history or as speaking of a moment about history,
Right.
Those are different.
Right.
The idea is that there is something antagonistic in this world that moves to make us estranged from God. Something outside of us and something that we nurture.
Yeah.
And I think that's the real heart of Genesis 3. And so the salvation story has been about overcoming that antagonism that wants to keep us estranged from God.
Yeah.
And how that happens and plays out is all kinds of, like, that's where the principalities and powers work. Stringfellow's words, I don't know if you want to go into it, his sort of take on it, but it might be helpful to sort of flesh this out.
Yeah.
He uses the words images, institutions, and ideologies when he talks about the powers. And so you actually just said the one for institutions, the way institutions act on us with that young man who just got married. I think it was the question of whether or not they were going to have a baby.
Oh, was that what it was?
I think
they had to get permission.
I think she got pregnant, and they're like, "Oh, this is going to mess with your career path."
Gotcha.
And so that's an example of the institution acting on you.
Right.
His famous example for images is Marilyn Monroe, because he was writing this in like the 50s and 60s. And he says, Marilyn Monroe, the person, is not Marilyn Monroe, the icon.
Right.
So even Marilyn Monroe, the icon, has a causal influence on Marilyn Monroe, the person, which we now know. We know her story really well to really understand that. And so, flesh that out into the world of social media, like your online persona versus who you are,
actually
how those
are,
interact with each other.
And
then ideologies are easy. Yeah. It's the isms: capitalism, Marxism, fascism, like
right.
any sort of
pacifism,
philosophical way of thinking.
Right. That if you buy into that, you have to then submit to that philosophy. You have to. It exerts authority over its followers, right? And it seems like you could be both an institution and an image, an icon, right? I mean, you've got America, the nation, that literally is an institution with laws and whatever, and then there's the America, however you think of America, whenever you think of it in your mind, whether you whitewash the history and it's the new Christian nation, or you blackwash it. That sounds bad. You erase all the good from it, and it's just this colonialism, horrible, always racist institutional evil, But you have an image of this thing, and how you see it influences you. Is that?
Yeah, I mean, I think that's right, and I think because I don't think they're one, like they can conflate and cross over, like you said, like a corporation has an image,
right.
In itself, and I'm trying to think of an example of a corporation, like maybe the the church is not like a corporation per se, but it is corporeal. It's made up of bodies.
Right.
And so the idea of maybe what the church is versus what it should be, I often tell when I talk about the church, you can talk about what the church is. What it is broken and frail and corrupt and with pockets of goodness. You can talk about what the church should be, what it's called to be, and vice versa. Like there's maybe your image of the church. Like I not to like dive into my own personal story, but like I grew up in the church and I was somehow able to do what people do these days, which is deconstruct their faith,
right?
without leaving the church. Somehow, the distinction just set it in with me early that my understanding of God was growing. My conception of what the church should be wasn't tied to what it is, what I had experienced. And so I was able to sort of stay in it and say, well, obviously, like the way you're talking about God is not the way I think we should talk about God. And I had teachers that helped me sort of just continue to pray, continue to worship, continue to follow Jesus, even as I was undoing some of what I had learned and, learning new things about and deepening my faith. But then there's some people who they have been so abused by the church, there's no chance they can do that.
Right.
And stay in it. They have to leave. And I get that.
Yeah.
Like, that's a real, those are different ways I think that the church can act as a principality and power. I think, but yeah, I think that's an interesting example about a body of people, an institution.
Well, speaking of the church, here's something that I don't know if this is a quote from you or a quote of Stringfellow from you, but I pulled this from your dissertation. You said, Stringfellow asks how the church can maintain the freedom of the gospel to proclaim the gospel in such a society in which the churches seem to be constantly tempted to forswear the gospel in order to protect our freedom as external institutions in society. In other words, like the way I understand that quote is the church is called to bear witness to Jesus, the kingdom of God, right? And Jesus's kingdom, he did not overcome the rulers and the authorities, the powers and principalities through power of influence and domination, but through sacrificial love. Like he let them dominate him. And then he exposed how empty those powers are by resurrecting from the dead. Even the power of death doesn't have power over his sacrificial love. Like it's the inverse of how the powers want to do things, right? And the church is supposed to bear witness to that king and that kingdom, but instead we're often tempted to give devotion to other powers and principalities of this world and use the power of those powers to give our influence over the world. And that's we actually forswear the gospel. We leave the gospel behind, the gospel of the sacrificial love, to dominate through influence and domination. Is that? Can you elaborate on that, or tell me I got that wrong, or?
No, I think that's right. I don't know if I wrote that or if I was quoting him or half quoting him with some of my language. Half of it sounded like me and half of it sounded like him.
It was in the conversation with Barth. You were going over that conversation with Barth where
yeah. So what it made me think of, and I'm curious if the footnotes reveal this, he tells a story about a time when somebody called him up. It was a church, and they were somebody had come to them, and they needed financial help. Like, electricity turned on or rent paid or something along those lines. And they're like, we just don't know about the money or how to help. And long story short, he knew that they had some really expensive like tapestries in their church. And he said, why don't you just sell those and help them? And it's a startling example, because we could all sell something.
Yeah.
And we could all justify the reasons for keeping it.
Right.
And I'm not going to answer that right now.
Right. Yeah.
But that's the question. That's the question he leaves us and says, I read that and I go, deny yourself, take up your cross, and follow is what I hear in that. I hear the rich man went away sad because he had a lot of wealth when Jesus told him to sell all he had and give it to the poor.
Right.
I also know that Peter was married and he had a home.
Right.
Jesus wouldn't have had a place to stay if Peter didn't have money and a home.
Mary,
maybe not money,
sure.
but he had some means.
Mary and Martha, right? They seem to have some means. I mean, all the churches were probably meeting in the homes of wealthy converts, people who had enough money to have a home that could house multiple people at different times. And then you have,
the conversation.
Yeah.
I was going to say the conversation about money makes it really difficult because we live in a monetized society. Like, I'm open to suggestions. I don't know how to plan for retirement without saving some money.
Right.
I don't necessarily need to become the next billionaire, but that would require me not giving some money. I was listening to some podcast. I think it was somebody. I can't remember who it was, but they basically said it would have been a lot easier if we didn't live in a monetized society. The question of money and what Jesus, they were saying the Gospels are all about economics is kind of what they were saying. It's all about resources, what you do with it, and how that impacts the lives of people. And even more than politics, the substance of economics as in the organization of a household, that's where the word comes from. It's how we organize our stuff to help each other. The Gospels are all about that, and it's really hard to be a Christian in a monetized world. That power, that principality, that thing that says I can't separate myself from this, it's acting on me, raises the next question of what does it mean then to act back faithfully in this world where we can't avoid having to do with money in some way.
Well, that's one of these powers, these rulers and authorities that are kind of nebulous, right? Kind of hard to wrap our mind around. Like McDonald's is a rule and authority. McDonald's isn't a person, and it's not made up of the same CEOs and board of directors today than it was 30 years ago, right? But it is what it is, and it's trying to stay alive. It's like this nebulous icon and institution that's trying to get people to serve it so it stays alive, right? Some of these powers and principalities are nebulous. It's hard to nail down. And one of the few powers and principalities that Jesus spoke about a lot was money. And he literally said, right, you can't serve two masters. You'll either be devoted to one and despise the other, or love the one and hate the other. You cannot serve God and money. And it's so how do we then use money in service to the kingdom of God, which probably means providing for our family? It's some of these things.
Well, and Stringfellow, he would say, just to interject this one thought, he would say it would be also, and so this leads into some of what one of my chapters was on, even as you were forced to reckon with the reality that we live in and through money, it is to question that.
Yeah.
It is to question that dynamic. It's to question where we give our money to, how we make our money, who is being hurt by this dynamic, and at the very least to name it and say this isn't right. Obviously that's easy to say, but that's where he would go with that. I think is because the world is always broken. It is a constant descent, is his word, against the principalities and powers. It is a constant, relentless naming, exposing, refusing, going down with a fight or without a fight, as Jesus did. But you know what I mean.
Yeah.
Jesus didn't fight, but he pushed against.
So would you say? Do you think it's that this a big part of this process, the reflexive part of this process, is learning how to discern and ask questions more so than finding a set of answers to stand on?
Oh, I don't know if I would juxtapose those two things.
Yeah.
But I don't know that it begins with answers. I think I mean, if politics in America has taught us anything, people who come with answers rather than questions, um, that's a really simplistic way of putting it. But I would love to see some people stand up and ask some better questions
Mm-hmm.
as they're trying to lead people.
Yeah.
Um, Obviously, I do I do think it's important to have some idea of a direction. We don't have to talk about politics if you don't want to,
Well,
but I think that's an interesting
I think we'll
example
definitely get there.
of
Yeah. I mean, I kind of want to
yeah.
land there eventually, in the next 20 minutes or so. But so because that's where we are, in this season right now. I mean, in what, 3 days away. So, but so we've got this idea of the powers and principalities, rulers and authorities, that try to influence us, and the churches, the Christians' calling is not to give devotion to those authorities and powers, not to try to usurp the power of the powers to proclaim the gospel, because we actually reject the gospel of this crucified king when we try to dominate and influence. Legislating morality and faith is a rejection of the gospel in many ways. So what would Stringfellow say we do? We don't go bury our heads in the sand. We don't become separatists and just hide away, hoping that our daily lives will influence people. He says let's engage. Let's be a part of the influence. So what does a Christian and or a church do to interact with a world full of powers without giving devotion to them? What do we do?
Yeah. Well, to that second part, it's interesting, and I won't elaborate too much on this because for Stringfellow, I should have said this earlier. The principalities and powers are created good but fallen. And so the idea that there would be these systems, processes that humans in our keeping and tilling of the earth might come up with are meant to serve. We're actually meant to have dominion over them, right? Because that's our calling, to keep and till the earth, and to create. And like, the best image I have for it, Wendell Berry helps me with this. It's the image of the farm. Like a well-functioning farm serves. You have dominion over it, but it's meant to serve the family and the community around it.
Yeah.
And that's how I think about it. But, the inversion happens. And so farming becomes big business and then becomes about money. And all of a sudden, you're not serving anymore. It's dominating you. And that's what happens.
Right.
It becomes flipped. So Stringfellow, I mean, his baseline running throughout anything, I mean, his life attested to this. I could do the brief biography, but it's always about those who are being oppressed. It's always about the poor. Anything that is crushing people is where the church needs to exert itself and expose, and try and do something about. The details of that are always harder to define because that's very on the ground and hard to speculate on. But I always say this, my elevator pitch for Stringfellow is that he was a white male Episcopal Harvard trained lawyer who in 1956 goes and moves. Then I pause and I say, with those credentials, in 1956 in America, you have all the power in the world.
Yeah.
You can do anything you want. And he goes and moves to Harlem, New York, to practice law amongst the poor, to live in the city, not just work there, but he lives there and sets up office there. That's incarnation. That's what Jesus did by coming, the Word becoming flesh and dwelling among us. He's not perfect, Stringfellow,
Right.
but it's those moves toward really knowing those around us who are hurting and need help and need advocacy. That was his thing. He's like, I'm just going to go in here. I'm going to advocate for the people who have nobody to advocate for them. And did it for free a lot. I'm not quite sure how he made it in those first years.
Right.
But that would be an example for him of like, so, the words I use as the subject of my chapters are realism, dissent, and intercession. Realism, we've talked about, this is the idea that the world is always broken. There's nothing we could ever do to change it that would then correct that. The world's always broken.
Yeah.
Dissent, we've talked about, it is the constant just sort of presence to expose the power of, you're constantly against the presence of death in the world. The flip side of dissent, though, is intercession. As you are against, you are for. And so to be against the presence of death is to be for those for whom death is causing oppression and suffering and violence and the diminishing of human life is how he puts it. Anything that is diminishing human life, we dissent against and we advocate for.
Yeah.
Like for the flourishing.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So, let's try to bring it home then to right now, the church, the Western church, I don't think it's just an American thing. I think it's a European thing. And we are tempted to exert power to gain influence. We're afraid of oppression, I think, in a lot of ways. Like there's this, they make us say Happy Holidays instead of Merry Christmas because they want to take Christ out of Christmas, and they, we need to elect the people who are going to legislate for Christian values, and there's this merging of patriotism and faith. That I've been in some context where if I didn't display an appropriate amount of patriotism in church, that I would be judged probably worse. Now, I don't know if maybe I'm being judgy, but I would have been judged as maybe a bad Christian, a bad pastor, at least a ingrateful recipient of freedom and whatnot. So, if you could give some advice to someone who has ears to hear, to say, okay, maybe the way I've been engaging politics as a Christian, maybe it does reflect more of the world's power than Christ's sacrificial love. Like, what do you think Stringfellow would say to someone who's open to hear? Like, where do I start? How do I start changing my mind and actions on this?
Yeah, that's like the question. I have problems with the language of Christian values. Because it means only a few things, and if you don't agree with me, then you're not a Christian. In fact, you should probably lose your job as a pastor.
Just to say that there are such things as Christian values, that sometimes different people have different ideas of what those values are, right? And so then if you don't agree with my definition of Christian values, you're either a bad Christian or probably not a Christian in the first place. That's what you're...
Yeah. So like Stringfellow along the way would critique the idea that what it means to be Christian is to be middle class American. Like that seemed like it seemed to exclude a number of people. Like you had, like, in order to receive the gospel, you need to like rise up in your socioeconomic status, and then you'll be in a place where you can be a Christian. That's ridiculous.
Sure.
And that's what he said. I think it takes, I'll say two things. Somehow, allowing what it means to be baptized into the body of Christ
Mm-hmm.
to subvert um, your idea that, not you, but like
Right,
the
right,
collective you,
right. Yeah.
your idea that you are also an American and that those identities can coexist. Of course, we live in the places we live. Paul, at a moment in time, used his Roman citizenship to aid in his service of the gospel. So I'm not saying like renounce your Americanness as such,
Yeah.
but the identities of what that means, you know, in the Revelation, the image is to come out of the beast, come out of the empire, like leave it,
Yeah.
don't let it exert its influence and control on you.
Mm-hmm.
And so I think what it means is a better understanding of what it means to lose our identity into the life and death of Jesus. To the extent that we can have a conversation about politics and issues that isn't inherently divisive. And I say that with some trepidation because I'm slowly losing my ability to be a person who says, well, we need to find the middle ground, because I believe in truth.
Right.
And I use that word.
There's no middle ground on whether there's truth or not. Is that what you're saying? It's hard to.
Yeah, like you shouldn't murder people.
Yeah, there's no middle ground there. Yeah.
Yeah. And I realize that there are even scales of that. Like somebody comes into your home and you kill them. Like I'm not even talking about that. I'm just like I understand that there are complexities in here, but like I think there are some things. I think there's a way of human flourishing that doesn't need to like settle on middle grounds. And I would love to pursue that with people who want that.
Mm-hmm.
The flip side is, there's a lot of talk about how our society has developed. The word neoliberal comes up, which is a way of identifying. Sorry, this gets kind of nerdy, but like, in late capitalism and this sort of excessive amounts of money and power and the idea of competition sort of sets in.
Sure.
That's how I sort of pare down to come to understand the sort of base reality of neoliberalism. And there's a debate about whether or not the neoliberalism is and how it's still active in the world. But competition is the sense that we need to show up and win.
Mm-hmm.
If I could put one thing into the air right now, I would say the church should not have as its base a sense of competition, especially in society. Culture wars don't make sense to the kingdom of God, because it creates a power dynamic in the bad way, like in a way that says, you're right and I'm wrong, or I'm right, you're wrong, and I want to just crush you for that.
Yeah, the only people that Jesus ever presented himself, and I don't know if it's even fair to say that he presented himself in competition. But the only people he picked a fight with was the religious powers, the religious authority of his day. Like when he said, "You guys are a brood of vipers." That's a big thing for a Jewish person to say to somebody, to another Jew. Like you're a snake, you're a serpent, a bunch of serpents. You're making people who follow you twice the sons of hell as you are. Like he stood against the rulers and authorities who are exerting a form of dominion over the people. And then Jesus submitted to that very power to the point of death. and that's how he won. And that's
Mhm.
been, I mean, the word for witness is martyr, right?
Mhm.
And the martyrs of
Yeah.
the faith are those who stood in witness against the powers. And, you know, the cliche that the church was watered by the blood of the saints, that the
Mm.
church has grown not not by Constantinian exertion of power, but through sacrificial love and being agents of the Holy Spirit that actually changes hearts.
Yeah, grown is an interesting word because the church grew because of Constantine,
Yeah,
right? Like it
right,
got
right,
bigger and like, but
right.
I know what you meant by that.
Yeah,
Um, it might another way to say that is like it better it it's better demonstrated
mm-hmm. Yeah,
when through the sacrifice of the martyrs.
yeah,
And I'll even like say you don't have to die to be a martyr. Of course,
right.
you can bear witness, but it's the trajectory of your life, right? Is it going, is it in line with the way of the cross?
Yeah,
Um, and that's a question we all have to ask ourselves. Um, and it's tricky, like, you know, because there are real issues that people are concerned about. But I think until we get over our need to win and exert dominance in society, the church will struggle with faithfulness. It
mm,
will be about preserving its own institutional power and presence
mm.
as opposed to being faithful to the gospel. I don't see another way around it. Um, and so, if you're looking for a church, try and find some that are leaning towards faithfully expressing the kingdom versus trying to win
Yeah,
in the world. Might be a good place to
yeah.
start.
It's scary. It's scary because when we endeavor to fight our political battles the world's way, like we're no different than any other lobbying group. You
Mm-hmm.
know, we are the NRA. We are the lobby groups for the LGBTQ plus whatever. We are just another group who's trying to get our viewpoints and our values institutionalized. And that's not, we're not just one more sect.
Yeah.
Like we're
Well, and that's where
yeah.
you brought up the Mennonite witness, right?
Yeah.
The people who sort of are the extreme example of with social withdrawal. Like
Yeah.
we're going to go do our own thing over here, and yet the Mennonites would never say they're that withdrawn from society, of course.
Mm-hmm.
But I think about the Mennonite, it was the Amish, but it's the same family,
Yeah.
extended
Yeah. Yeah.
families. Um, uh, the shooting that happened at the school several years ago,
Mm-hmm.
um, like the fallout from that was amazing. The tragedy, of course,
Mm-hmm.
but the fact that they responded the way they did. Um, I'm thinking particularly of uh, their embrace of the mom of the young man who did the shooting. Um, like she was broken about what her son did, and their ability to bring her in and offer healing.
Mm-hmm.
Like you can't do that if you're trying to win in politics.
Right. Right.
You can't be that person. You're not being formed to be that person if you're trying to get legislation passed.
Yeah.
I'm really speaking. I'm making probably some strong overstatements, but I think they need to be said because I think it needs to make us pause about what we're trying to do. Because Stringfellow will also say that the civil rights movement was a good thing.
Yeah.
The idea of exerting political pressure
Right.
to change laws for people who were being oppressed by them. And so I'm not actually trying to discern one way or the other. It's more of what attitude are you taking and to what end? Like, that's why the competition thing is interesting, because I don't think the civil rights movement was about competition.
Mm-hmm.
They weren't trying to win so that other people would lose,
Right.
just inherently. Like, they were trying to win. Like, so I would interpret that through Stringfellow's lens by saying, you know, he has a story actually about there was a clergy march across a certain region during the early days of the civil rights movement, and some of the priests were arrested. And he uses the ad example of saying the policemen who did the arresting, their humanity was diminished in that because of what they were forced to do and asked to do, and maybe even wanted to do. But I'm sure that there was all kinds of opinions about that on their side of things. And so that would be an example of saying, look, by changing laws to elevate and enhance the lives of people being oppressed actually elevates and enhances your humanity.
Yeah.
Because you're then not stuck in a system that causes you to be oppressive. And it was, I think it was Willie James Jennings. I think it was in his Acts commentary. If you've not read Willie James's Acts commentary, Willie James Jennings, it's just the best. But he says the movement within the Black church, and to sort of generalize that, wasn't to create a new hierarchy. Like, Black people didn't want to rise up to then dominate, because that just creates a new social hierarchy, and the same thing then has to happen. It was an elevation to a level playing field. And whether or not that's happened, like, that's a different question. But like that's the move behind it. And that to me is like, you know, if you're looking for glimpses into, like, for me, what I think it looks like to do that well, like, I'm leaning towards those things in terms of how I think about them and how I'm trying to act in the world. I always say I'm not much of an activist, but I'm really moved and energized by activists. But I hope I can think well about these things and maybe offer that to the best of my ability.
You know, I know that, well, I think I know that you are saying there's, in any given moment, there's probably a right and a wrong. Like, maybe there's right ways to handle it and wrong ways, like not just one right way, but like there are, in any given situation, there's a good chance that there's a very wrong way to handle it and a very right way to handle it. But maybe what's most important for a lot of us is just to wake up to the idea that we should ask these questions. Like, is the way that I'm engaging the political environment, is it exalting Christ above all else? Does it look like the love of God demonstrated on the cross? Am I able to engage with the fruits of the Spirit? And if like, I need to ask these questions: do my activities, my thoughts, my feelings, my psychological direction, is it reflecting Christ or something else? And if it's something else, then maybe we need to change the way we think, change the way we're talking, and change what we're doing. And I will just say, the way that Christians have been, the way that many Christians are engaging the political landscape these days, is difficult for me to watch. And I'm even as I was about to say it, I checked myself. I was like, well, how are you reacting to that? Are you reacting to that in a way that reflects Christ, with the fruits of the Spirit? But I think it's okay. I think it's okay for us to be upset with our tribe for not reflecting the core value of our tribe, which is that sacrificial love. I mean, if you're going to say there's a Christian value, it's sacrificial love, right? So so just be able to ask those questions. I got at least one more question for you, and you can plead the fifth on this one. I was listening to a podcast. Who's the Jesus for President guy? He wrote Jesus for President like decades ago.
Shane Claiborne.
I was listening to an interview with him, and they had a long discussion about like, will you say the Pledge of Allegiance? Will you participate in the national anthem? And I like just saying that. There are some people in my life who might be really offended that I would even ask the question, and I get it. I mean, you and I are able to have this conversation right now without worrying about people kicking down the doors and enslaving us, and that freedom was won by an institution, many institutions, the military complex. Like there's who knows what would have happened if they didn't do it. Whatever. Like I get it. I understand that. I understand the privilege of being able to ask the question. But for a long time now, since as I was processing through Stringfellow, I got to say, putting my hand over my heart and saying, I pledge allegiance to anything except Christ, rubs me the wrong way. I'm not. What did Jesus say? If you don't hate your father, mother, brother, or sister, your wife, your own life, you can't be my disciple. Like, compared to my devotion to Jesus, I do hate the United States of America.
Jesus is so extreme.
Yeah. So what?
Settle down a notch.
What do you think? What do you think about those questions? And you can plead the fifth. I'm not here to get you in trouble, even though I just laid myself out.
I'm not worried about it. I'm not worried about this one. I've read and been influenced by too much Stanley Hauerwas to say the Pledge of Allegiance anymore as a Christian.
I don't know Stanley.
It doesn't. You can go look. I mean, that was kind of a joke. He just wrote a lot about the relationship between church and state and the witness of the church within that. And he was early for me, like in college when I started reading him, and so I made that move shortly thereafter. I have that softened is not the right word. That's what I was going to say. So no, I don't say the Pledge of Allegiance for that reason. My baptism into the body of Christ doesn't make sense to say Jesus is Lord and then say the Pledge of Allegiance. With that, though, it doesn't mean that I don't care about the foreign land that I'm in, called America.
Right.
That's the exilic position in the Bible. Like you've been taken away and you live in a different place. Seek the welfare of the city.
Yeah.
And I've landed there on how I think about, what it means to be, because I'm still in it. I have to reflexively engage within the American social complex and political complex,
Right.
And so I try and think about that in those ways. It's interesting. I'll share this story just because I think it's funny. I don't actually really preach against like America or the politics. Like I don't get into that stuff, but I do talk a lot about like what's going on in kind of broadly speaking, like cultural dynamics, individualism, broadly speaking about nationalism, consumerism, like those kinds of like broad kinds of dynamics things.
Yeah.
Because I think those are powers that affect our discipleship. And we have this one guy who is old in our church. He's a Vietnam vet. And real quiet guy, but I like him. He likes me. And one Sunday, it was a Sunday, or like during the week after a July 4th, not too long ago. I can't remember. And I don't do patriotic things in church.
Yeah.
Like nothing of those. Our liturgy is Christian worship. And he came up to me, and he goes, this is like understand the mood. This is an okay moment. And he goes, why can't you say anything nice about America? And I was like, I don't really think I've said anything like terribly like mean about it. I haven't been like railing on it.
Right.
But it wasn't the soft landing, heartfelt blending of faith and of church and state.
Yeah.
Like, you know what I mean? Like, it wasn't that. And I will say this. That made me pause because I respect him. I respect his faith. And I wanted to take that seriously as his pastor. And I think of what I said is, I don't think I've done that, but that's a good question. And I'm going to think about that and take it to heart. And I've thought about that. And I think the way I would say this is, I don't believe there's a book out there by David Dark called The Possibility of America. I've only read bits and pieces of it. It's an interesting read, but I love the title. And I'm really careful when I say this right now. Like, I don't think I believe in the possibility of America, like as if I'm going to put my hopes and dreams on it. Yeah. But there's an interesting experiment here that has a strange, distorted, maybe beautiful, probably not, probably partially relationship with Christianity. At least distorted versions of it coming out of modernity. But there's something there that I think is interesting. And so if you're going to go with Stringfellow and believe that the principalities and powers are good but fallen, you kind of have to hope in their redemption. Because that's where the story goes, the redeeming of the principalities and powers to be what they were created to be.
Yeah.
And all implied into that, what I said about how the world is broken until the end of all things, until God fixes it. So I'm not saying like we can fix America.
Sure.
I'm just saying there's ways the church can lean into.
You just want to make America great again, is what I hear you saying.
Yeah.
Just kidding.
No.
Just kidding. Yeah, you said something there that is another.
And also,
go ahead.
I'll say, I'm sorry.
No.
I know that like I wish somebody's going to hear that and like I need like another hour to unpack what I mean by that. And I know we don't have it.
Yeah.
But I'm not.
This is such a. I mean, it's such a pillar for my faith, and it is such a. It is probably the of those pillars I talked about, the one that I understand. I feel like I have my head wrapped around it the least. One of the key indicators for me is my hope, all of my hope, my security, all of my security, my salvation, all of my salvation is in Christ and Christ alone. And I feel like a lot of times we try to find comfort and hope and peace and security in these other powers, whether it be financial stability, whether it be America as we see it, the image of America that we're trying to recreate with our political engagement. We want that because we think it'll give us a sense of security. It'll give us hope. It'll give us peace. And any time we think that we can get that somewhere other than Christ, I think we are inching into idolatry. Actually, I don't think we're inching. I think we've dove in head over heels into idolatry. And so however we engage any power, it's got to be, how can I leverage this entity in such a way to exalt Christ as the source of hope, peace, salvation, life, money has to be a what's the word? Goodness gracious. Money is used for the love of Christ. It's a currency of God's love. How can I use money as a currency of God's love? Not as a place where I find power or comfort or security. And so yeah.
And it may just be that we can't. Like I think that's where Stringfellow's conception of realism and dissent, like you talk about pillars, like that's what it is for them. Obviously, like right now, like you can wake up tomorrow and be like, how can I use the money I have to help people?
Right.
Which you should. Like that's great. But it may just be that our conceptualizing of a world around money is actually not the way of the kingdom. That there might
the overall
have to be
system
other ways to think
is
about.
always going to be broken
Yeah.
and serving the darkness of this world in some way.
Yeah. And I say that to keep those two pieces together because the practical reality is that we're all going to wake up tomorrow in a monetized society and we're going to have to make choices about what we do with our money. And we can do that with a sense of exactly what you said with trying to elevate Christ, right?
Yeah.
But Stringfellow would also say in the same moment, probably, I'm guessing about money, that money commodifies everything and divides people. And like, you know, since its inception, it's been a long time coming, maybe to the extreme cases that it hurts people today, with such wealth gaps and things like that. Like, for me, that's what's at stake is like nothing's off the table when we are being questioned by the gospel. Like when Jesus says, "Who do you say that I am?" Like it goes deep.
Yeah.
To that answer, and I think the inversion of that is, who are you? Like as my disciples, like because who you say I am is who you are going to imitate me as.
Yeah. Gosh, man, if we could show up as disciples of Jesus and not as proponents of any other institution, and whenever our proponentism, however we show up as a proponent for another system or philosophy or institution, gets in the way of us actually representing the sacrificial love of Jesus and the invitation to take up somebody's cross and follow, not to take up my mantle of power and influence, but to take up the cross of Jesus and follow him. Man, when we've just got to find a way to live in this world where we're carrying our cross and inviting others to carry their crosses, and not carrying a big stick to beat people into submission with. It's man, if we would do that, I mean that's the calling, right? Oh.
Yeah.
Scott, do you have any last words? Any like nuances of Stringfellow or just your own, as you've been sitting in the midst of, a political season that just seems like it gets more polarized every season? Like, are there any final words that you would leave us with?
Oh man. I mean, there's a lot to say about the details of the political world, elections and support groups and people raising money and fundraisers and stuff like that. Man, I don't know if I have any advice on that right now. I mean, other than like just stuff that I've said. I think I've said a few things along the way. I mean, as a pastor, I'm always calling us to pray. And for me, prayer is not just closing your eyes and bowing your head and saying words. Prayer is an act of attention to the divine, to ourselves, and to the world around us. and just learning how to be good to the people who are right in front of you might be a good place to start. It's hard because in this political climate, like we're not out of the woods on the kinds of divisions that are out there and the rhetoric being used. And so it feels hard to sort of bring anything home. I feel like we need to learn how to call oppressive language and rhetoric and actions to account.
Yeah.
And and to do that faithfully. And yeah, I mean, I might just leave it at that unless you have a follow-up question within that.
No, man, I just, when I first heard of even the idea of rulers and authorities, powers and principalities being something other than demons, and that we have to check our devotion to these things. At first I thought, well, that's an easy concept. Like, there are other rulers and authorities out there. My job, my understanding of family, I mean, my church, like the country I live in, I get it. Like, I've got to make sure, all I got to do is make sure that my devotion is always to Jesus. But then the more I process through it, it's like, man, okay, well, so what does that actually mean? Like, should you vote? Who should you vote for? Should you argue or debate, lovingly debate with people about things it's become a lot more complicated. And I'm really grateful for people like you, Scott, who help me learn more of what questions to ask. Because I think in life we always want to have easy answers because we don't like tension. But that's not a mature life. A mature life is able to live in the tension of increasing questions, as opposed to always increasing answers. And so I'm really, really grateful for this conversation and the way it's helped me think about what questions I need to ask myself as I'm facing various influences in my life in the world.
Yeah, I mean, I've been grateful that you asked and that just I had a chance to come talk about it. And even in our conversation, like before we got online, the texts throwing back and forth, like just what you said, we might be leaning towards talking about, forced me to think, like, okay, like, there's things in Stringfellow I can talk about because I wrote about it, but then there's some broader things involved in that I didn't write about.
Right.
That I'm like, I need to like sit with this. Not that I need to have like the language all worked out for myself or my thinking, but just to be like, all right, like what do you actually think about some of these things, and how might that matter when we think about the witness of the church and all that stuff. So I was grateful for your questions, and even in this conversation, some of the things that where you took it and forced me to think about. I was like, that stuff needs to be leaned into. So
well, maybe we need to have a follow-up conversation.
Yeah, man.
It'd be super fun if we had if somebody actually watched this and listened to it and then got like specific questions.
Sure.
I come back and just like, I mean, I feel like almost all my answers would be like, man, I don't know. I'll say this, but I don't know. That's probably be most of my answers.
Yeah, I mean, it's a tough conversation, and anything, anything that gets remotely into the details becomes extremely divisive.
Yeah.
And it's tough. It's tough
Yeah,
to do that,
yeah,
especially
yeah.
if you care about the people you're talking to. But if you care about the truth, and certainly as you understand it, and certainly as you think you're pursuing, you know, you got to wade into those conversations.
Well, and that
Somehow.
defensiveness, I don't want to say always, but that defensiveness just might be a sign of idolatry. Because Jesus doesn't need to be defended. And if you get defensive or offended because I don't show the devotion to the nation, institution, or philosophy that you hold dear, I mean, it just might be a sign that there's a diverted devotion in your heart somewhere.
Yeah.
And that's scary because
he didn't defend himself.
Yeah, right. Yeah, literally.
Right?
Yeah.
Literally.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Well, Scott, man, thanks so much. Man, is there anything that you want to direct people to for you? Do you have a website or a blog or a book? I found your dissertation downloadable. You can point people to that.
Yeah, I mean, the dissertation I think is out there. Yeah, no, I mean, I don't traffic in that sort of world.
Yeah, yeah.
At the moment, at least, I am hoping to get the dissertation published. I would love for it to be out there.
100%.
That's my next step. The only thing, if anybody is interested, is the preaching podcast through our website. You can find my sermons. www.samonaz.org, SAMONAZ.
Okay. And your dissertation is a reflexive approach to Christian witness, a theology of social involvement through the life and writings of William Stringfellow. And I'm 30 pages in, and it's fantastic. So,
it's a stellar read.
30 pages and 2 hours and 11 minutes of conversation in. So, yeah.
I will say this about my thesis. Because of the nature of Stringfellow's writing, there's a lot of his life in there. And so there are sections that get bogged down in theological language that people might not like. You're obviously like one of those people that likes that stuff. But there's a fair amount of story because I use his life along with his writings to make my argument. And he's just a fantastic person.
Well, you say his theology. You say a lot that it's a biological theology. Don't you use a phrase like that a lot, or something like that? That is his
biographical theology.
Yeah. What did I say? Biological.
Yeah, and by that I mean,
that too?
Which it is. It is that too. It just means like he just works out his theology in and through his life. Like, you can't separate his thinking from what he's actually doing in the day-to-day life. Whereas a lot of theology books, you can entertain the ideas and there might be like anecdotes, but like. For Stringfellow, I couldn't just read his books and write about him. I had to like go study 20th century American history because he would like allude to things like politicians or social movement. Like, wait, I don't even know. And then it would like open up this whole new line. I'm like, okay, like there's just so much embedded in his writings that speak to his life in America in the 20th century.
You had to exegete Stringfellow.
I had to exegete Stringfellow. And with that, I got to read some American history, which was fun.
God bless you.
Yeah.
Thanks again.
Sounds good, man. I appreciate it.